I'm super excited that we have a talk today from Dr. Suniti Karunatillake at Louisiana State, who is one of my longest running, most prolific collaborators, and also just one of my best friends in planetary science from when we first met in graduate school. Suniti is originally from Sri Lanka and came to the US to do his bachelor's degree in physics at Wabash College in Indiana, and then, like me, headed to Cornell for graduate school, where our shared PhD advisor, Steve Squires, only ever had 2 PhD students at a time, and so when I arrived there, Suniti was the senior student in the group, and he was working with Mars Exploration Rover data as well as the Mars Odyssey gamma ray spectrometer, some data from which you can see at upper left on the screen at the moment. And so I went to Cornell to work with data from the HiRISE camera, which was the highest spatial resolution instrument then or since in Mars orbit, whereas the gamma ray spectrometer may well be the lowest spatial resolution instrument in Mars orbit, but is informing about a different thing, chemistry instead of morphology. And I think some colleagues in the Mars science community felt that, between those 2 data sets is a bridge too far, but Suniti and I saw it as a great complementary opportunity. And so again, we started collaborating. He was generous to invite me as a junior graduate student onto one of his projects in graduate school, and we've basically collaborated on a number of projects ever since then, as he moved on to postdoc at Stony Brook University, a brief stint as an assistant professor at Rider University in New Jersey, and now to LSU, where he has been a professor, now is an associate professor for the past 2 years. And he continues to do, like me, a lot of his work on Mars, but also thinking about some other planetary bodies as well as Earth analogs, which I think is going to be a big part of what he tells us about today. So yeah, excited for the talk, and take it away, Dr. Karunatillake.
Great. Thanks very much, James, especially for that background. Always great collaborating with you. Also bucking that trend, like you mentioned, straddling the especially coarsest data set for regional insight with the highest resolution data sets, and a little bit of infrared spectroscopy infused for good measure that James had contributed to when we were looking at the radar stealth area on Mars. So to dive into today's discussion, I'm going to keep the visual background behind me for context, but this slide that you see here is replicating that. And one of my research colleagues in Sri Lanka is along the coastline at this outcrop here of Serpentinites, weathering Serpentinites, that is for scale. And like James mentioned, we also have the map of iron abundance, which will have an important story to tell us as we go forward in motivating this particular zone on the island of Sri Lanka that's in lime green. So to shift to the story itself, starting with the title, this work is obviously enabled by a substantial collaborative group, particularly colleagues out in Sri Lanka as well. And I'm going to start by sharing with you some of the things that motivate us as a group in thinking about serpentinization in the context of habitability, that thread of life theme on Mars specifically. And I have like Bethany Ellman's 2010 work for a bit of context there, where the serpentine minerals identified on Mars are noted in a greenish hue, along with some other related minerals. And then we'll also try to consider a bit why we need additional example analog sites of serpentinites or serpentinization processes on our planet, given that there are so many that have already been explored. So there's this example I have here in the Simail ophiolites of Oman that have often been considered in the Martian context. And then afterwards, we'll shift focus onto the island itself, Sri Lanka, and go through a bit of detail on some of the motivating works that interested us in this, and then a bit of the geologic context, so we get a better grasp of why this particular zone, how it can relate to Martian counterparts, and ending on the fun side with a few field images, kind of sharing our experience that we had when we conducted a feasibility survey in 2018. So as that might hint to you, much of this discussion is going to be a bit of a fishing expedition, sharing with you the exploratory ideas that I'm emerging, especially stuff that I'd like to explore with colleagues like James out at Georgia Tech. But there may be a few hypotheses scattered here and there that could anchor us a little. So first, the attitude we've taken in the serpentinization context. In the Martian side of things, we've been especially interested in ultramafic rocks altering under like essentially hydrothermal conditions, 300 to 600 degrees Celsius range in the presence of water, and leading then to a whole suite of serpentine minerals similar to what Chris Oz had highlighted back in 2005 when he mentioned have olivine will gas in the context of methane. But before getting to that, the specific example, serpentine mineral shown here, antigorite, I chose that purposely because that tends to be the dominant serpentinite found on the serpentine zone on the island. Again, just for reference, the one in lime green in the virtual background behind me. So while the immediate product ends up being hydrogen, in a Martian setting, we are also interested in the possibility of CO2-rich fluids, given for one, Martian atmosphere having a higher CO2 partial pressure compared to Earth's. And that, in addition to producing methane, there is also the side note that serpentinization generally can also lead to magnetite, which can then take us towards thinking about remnant crustal magnetization through chemical means as opposed to the thermal means that have typically been considered in the literature. And Sri Lanka does host magnetites that have formed through serpentinization, and how they have weathered over geologic timescales and what type of signatures they bear could also help us set additional context for the Martian counterparts. So that's another motivating aspect. And I think in particular, serpentinization and chemical remnant magnetization on Mars, we have a manuscript currently under review led by another mutual conspirator between James and me, Luigi Oja, whom some of you might recall from his time doing his PhD at Georgia Tech. So taking this story of serpentinization as it interests us in the Martian context, how broadly significant is it? So as you probably guessed from Luigi's paper, we are trying to attribute global significance to serpentinization. And there's some grounding in that. One in the lower right hand, this is where the chemical mapping from nuclear spectroscopy, like the Mars Odyssey gamma ray spectrometer, can really help. We end up seeing at decimeter depth scales. So while the gamma ray spectroscopy is really coarse in resolution and might convey the sense that it's essentially subduing the degree of insight we can get into geologic processes, it does offer a really competitive depth sensitivity. Decimeter depth scales pretty much throughout the planet, which rivals that of most other instruments, aside maybe from radar observations, but those don't have global coverage. So the iron map shown here, in relation to Earth, as many of you would immediately recognize, is high overall. And then there are also spots of substantial enrichment, including in areas close in proximity to large basins like Exodus, so we'll return to that in a bit as well. And collectively, this makes it perhaps more feasible for serpentinization to happen on Mars, with the likelihood of lots of ultramafic rock units in spatial extent compared to what we typically find on Earth. And supporting that, if we look at this numerically on the left-hand side, we have the frequency like equivalent roughly to the aerial coverage of different abundances of iron, and you can see how the FeO equivalent that we determine stoichiometrically is generally staying well above like 18% by mass. And if we factor in meteoritic data, those don't dispute that. So you see that in the lower figure here. And at the outcrop scale, this is borne out to some extent. So if you look at these past works, shifting our focus perhaps to places like the Exodus Basin again, we have exposures of serpentine minerals. The distinctive type is a bit difficult to pin down, as James would probably share with you in terms of infrared spectroscopy. But the general serpentine group its presence is pretty well established, at least at the outcrop scale. So if we combine that map on the left with the really regional scale chemistry on the lower right, and are willing to accommodate the contrast in spatial resolution, it takes us towards thinking about serpentinization more broadly throughout Mars, and maybe these outcrops are limited exposures of what is more substantial throughout the planet, and what it might mean in the context of terrestrial analogs. And equally important, I've noted hydrogen and methane as byproducts to some extent in the Martian setting of serpentinization, and the diverse suite of minerals you get as serpentines. So collectively, this creates a veritable soup in which terrestrial microbes can certainly thrive. And there's the supporting aspect of a geothermal gradient that these zones often establish locally, which allows independence from the need for photosynthetic processes to support energy conversions for life. So there's clearly that thread of life that ties all of this together. And then if we go to our next waypoint here of analog sites, and particularly the question of, do we need to even worry about additional analog sites, given that there are so many that have been studied relatively extensively, such as the ones shown numbered here? We find a few motivating aspects for that in this context of the island of Sri Lanka. One, in the Martian context, a substantial amount of the emphasis on serpentinization, both ongoing as well as serpentine zones that were active maybe millions of years ago, are oftentimes associated with ophiolitic sequences, like the one where I have a crude schematic shown in the upper right-hand corner. And geologically speaking, they are typically narrowing our focus to the types of processes that can lead to serpentinization to what's schematized here in the Semile example. I'm highlighting that again because we often mention it in the literature in the context of Martian serpentinization. So this is an instance where you get a good swath of the oceanic lithosphere abducted right onto a continental plate. And it gives a very cool exposure of the oceanic lithosphere and also enables ongoing serpentinization in places like Oman. At the same time, though, it does focus us exclusively on that type of geologic setting, which may perhaps make us overlook other processes related to serpentinization, like where you could have ultramafic intrusive bodies, which drive serpentinization that could perhaps in some ways be an equally significant counterpart to Martian serpentinites that interest us. And that could be where this particular island locale comes to play for future exploration. At this point, Mars analog exploration is somewhat limited for this island. So that's exciting in a sense that there's lots to be found. The drawback, obviously, is that fishing expedition side of things, that we have a sense of what promise it offers, but are not yet ready to articulate what the specific processes are and how they might relate to or rather how they might constrain the particular types of Martian geologic processes of serpentinization. Having acknowledged that, I will step us through the motivating works that tie us most closely with the Martian counterparts, and then I will step into the somewhat of a broader geologic context of how this serpentinization occurred on the island a couple of 100 million years ago, leading to the Serpentinites we see there now. And then conclude with the fun side of things, as I mentioned, a quick peek at what we saw out in the fields when we conducted the feasibility survey in 2018. So our intent is to follow this with an actual expedition, collecting samples and analyzing them for geochemical pathway insight as well as overall geologic process with Mars in mind specifically in 2022, hopefully towards June, assuming the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't get too much in the way. So beginning with the motivating works, there's several aspects, and one of those relates to the presence of different minerals in the soils that have been derived over geologic timescales from the Serpentinites. So we have a few example images from the field here on the left, showing the variability of the soils here. And you can see me trying to extract a 1 liter core there out at the bottom as well, looking a bit like a Martian myself. And the biohazard side that we emphasize, so this is coming from a work that a group of us led in 2016, using the soils similar to those that are shown here at about 2 of the sites or locales of the contiguous serpentine zone that is in the virtual background that you see behind me. And at those 2 sites, we used the soils as perhaps analogous to Martian serpentine-rich soils that could be produced in areas of at least the serpentine mineral-bearing outcrops, if not more widespread on the planet, and try to see how those soils would respond, if you will, chemically in the presence of perchlorate-bearing brines, since, at least in situ, we've seen perchlorates and other oxychlorine, reactive oxychlorine species relatively frequently. So going back to thinking of stoichiometry at Gusev crater and more well verified through mass spectroscopy as well at Gale crater, and suggested through like some of the aqueous lab experiments out at the Phoenix landing site. And we've noticed something quite intriguing in terms of what these soils might imply for habitability at the microbial level, as well as for what it might mean for future humans or colonies, if you will, that might wish to use Martian soils for agricultural purposes, if you think really ambitiously of like growing crops on Mars sometime in the future. So on the x-axis, we have the variable concentration of perchlorate solutions that we've introduced, weight per volume. And on the y-axis, we have the rate of release of cation forms that in the Earth context are often indicators of biohazards for human habitats. And this certainly applies on the island of Sri Lanka as well, of soil toxicity for agriculture and humans who ingest the derived agricultural products. The key message I would like to get out of this is to the absence of perchlorate. And this can introduce an evolutionary challenge for microbes that may have, particularly in past geologic settings, try to exploit the soil or sediment produced, like autochthonous, locally produced sediment out in serpentinite settings on Mars, and then future looking towards humans using soils in such settings. And we've also seen intriguingly that if you have low pH, this effect is accentuated compared to higher pH values. So that could be a plus in some ways, that perchlorate has perhaps a bit of a moderating effect on pH. But we do generally think in the Martian context of oftentimes low pH environments in the past, even though in the future, like humans using these soils, we could adjust the pH to ameliorate some of this effect. So that's one point. We've looked at these two pieces on the serpentine soils, and there's a whole diversity of pedogenesis essentially to explore at these sites, and those would take us towards the future. And closely tied to that are the variably developed soils we see here. A couple of example figures here to demonstrate, to kind of make that point. And in the legend, you'll see the boundary soils are designating where you transition from soils produced in the serpentine rich bedrock to the transition to the outcrops and bedrocks themselves. And there's a reference of serpentinites themselves, along with references of non-serpentine soils. And the key message I'd like to get here, a particular thing of the y-axis for like magnesium, nickel, iron, and manganese as examples, is a substantial variability in chemistry we see for the serpentine soils at these sites compared to some of the references, like crustal rocks of Sri Lanka, the metamorphosed sedimentary rocks, along with terrestrial references like Shanukites. And by characterizing how variable these soils are and what those compositional variabilities indicate for pedogenetic processes, we'd be better able to understand the possible pathways of pedogenesis associated with Martian serpentinites, possibly. And then moving to another motivating aspect relates to the interaction of water bodies in the serpentinites within this zone. So one, if we use geothermometers like we've done here, using the log of SiO2 versus the log of potassium squared to magnesium ratios, with references on the quartz and amorphous silica scales, the letters are indicating just the many different sites that were sampled of hot springs on the surface. So extrapolating from these, we are getting an estimate in the range of generally between 100 to 150 degrees Celsius for many of the aquifers that drive the hot springs on the surface. So it's telling us that residual thermal gradients are sustained after a couple of 100 million years on these sites in this island. And then there's a related aspect to it in terms of how the water cycle is driven here. Contrary to our initial expectations that the source of water could be deep-seated, turns out that these rock units, even though heavily altered through serpentinization, are still pretty limited in porosity and permeability, which forces the water circulation to the shallower levels. And on the island, it's driven primarily meteorically, as we can see from this graph of delta H and delta O isotopic plots. And just to prime ourselves a bit on the zones shown here, WZ is for the more high precipitation zone on the island. It is a tropical island, so this thinking in excess of a meter of precipitation per year. But it can transition into a dry zone that's DZ, which goes down to less than half a meter. And there are places, certainly along the serpentine zone, where the rate of evaporation readily exceeds precipitation on an annualized scale. So it's not desert-like, but it can approximate arid settings. And the GMWL, that's the global reference for our planet. And so in this bigger graph, the take-home message is how most of these data, so the white disks indicating the hot spring samples, and the asterisks indicating cold springs and groundwater associated with the serpentine zone, both tend to follow a pretty narrow band that corresponds nicely with the meteoric waters on the island. So if we think back to the Martian counterpart, maybe ancient Mars, any hydrologic cycle associated with serpentinites might have been forced to a shallower zone because of limited porosity and permeability issues. And that's something we would try to model in future works at this site. And the inset image to the right, that's just giving us a reference in relation to oceanic waters. So SW1 there to the upper right-hand corner in the inset. That's right along the shoreline. The serpentine zone, as you can see in the virtual background behind me, does extend to the shoreline at both ends, northeast and southeast. So they sampled along those points. And SW2 is about 3 kilometers away into the ocean waters. And clearly the serpentine zone hot spring waters clustered distinctly from that, so there's no contribution from saline waters from the oceans either. Again, emphasizing that limitations in porosity and permeability at these settings that may apply for Mars, along with the coupled geothermal gradient. So this point that I'm at is what really excites me personally in terms of really deep processes that could serve as a good analog for how serpentinization may have played out on Mars. The hand sample here is showing how the serpentinites are physically associated with the magnesite, direct gradation from serpentinite to magnesite here. And there's a corollary to that when some of the zircon that were interestingly present in these serpentinites were, we were trying to date those. So in these chronologic assessments, there isn't anything unusual about the age values we are getting. It's in line with what's expected of the geology, about 480 million years plus or minus a few. The intriguing, unexpected aspect was the oscillatory zoning of the zircon crystals, like the example shown here to the lower right hand. And this type of oscillatory crystallization is pretty rare in ultramafic rock units on our planet. However, if you were to metasomatize mantle rocks with CO2-rich fluids, then zircon can form, and particularly in this oscillatory crystallization pattern. And that then reinforces the presence of like carbonates, especially magnesium carbonates. And the presence of magnesium can be directly tied to mafic minerals like, say, olivine. So how does this connect with Mars? Well, in the Martian context, borrowing from James, we do have magnesium carbonates that have also been detected in places like Isidis, co-present with the serpentinites. Those are in the green disks. The other disks are showing carbonates more generally, some of which the exposures may just not be in the right orientation or in terms of the exposures to highlight the magnesium carbonate presence. But taken all of these narratives together, we certainly have a point of reference here of mantle CO2 metasomatism as a possible direct counterpart to what we are seeing on Mars, where this island can provide the specific alteration pathways that the rock underwent in producing the serpentinites and associated magnesite units. So with that, I will take us a bit more to the specific geologic context of the island, giving us a better grounding on what has happened here. And I will make occasional references to Mars and serpentine forming as it may allow us, to the extent it allows us, that is. So first, the provenance of the serpentinites on the island. And I'm using serpentinite in the very general sense of referring to rocks where there's an abundance of serpentine minerals. And in this petrographic study to the lower right-hand corner, a magnified view there, as you can see from the scale of some of the serpentinites we find along this zone. It's the texture that interests us quite a bit. There's an olivine pseudomorph texture present throughout in these thin sections. And then you can still see some serpentinites present that we've labeled here, along with magnesite, hornblende, and chromite are the examples highlighted here. And collectively, this is telling us that the texture has been retained through the serpentinization process, and the magnesites, for example, are directly derived as part of that alteration pathway. And to get even more insight into the underlying process, we've looked at things like thorium, ytterbium to niobium, ytterbium ratios. And in this specific instance, the arrows on the lower right-hand corner, the nearly vertical one, that's indicating where you get the direction trend you might anticipate in this space if you were dominated in a subduction type of setting. CC is indicating a collision type of setting, and WPE would be intraplate alteration pathways. And then FC would be where you get fractional crystallization. So we can think in relation to those directions for the data at hand. And the yellow zone is showing the bulk of the serpentine mineral data plotted here in the chemistry. And then we have the mid-ocean ridge basalt and the ocean island basalt arrays of Earth for reference in the gray line out to the upper left. And then we have how the depleted versus enriched sources would play out for both MORB and OIB. And then we have the zones that would associate with oceanic arc systems to the left at lower values of NB to YB, and then active continental margins on the other side of it. And to re-emphasize, the yellow zone is showing where much of this variability is happening. There are a few specific examples given in the icons in the legend here. The key message we got from this is this kind of the transition between oceanic arc and active continental margins as the likely context for the serpentinization on this island. And that takes us to what is distinctly different from typical ophiolitic settings of a double subduction event that produced the entire serpentinite setting on the island. So here's a schematic that crudely visualizes what we are thinking of. And to get into a bit more of the details, we first need to remind ourselves of the geologic zones of the island. So there are three major ones. At the western side, we've got what's called the Vanni complex. In terms of its provenance, that's about closing on 2 billion years ago, but metamorphism particularly is in the range of about 500 to 600 million years ago. We have this gneissic to migmatitic degree of metamorphism. The highland complex that I just outlined is the next one that also, as the name suggests, bears the highest elevations on the island with metamorphosed sedimentary as well as metamorphosed igneous units. And the age of metamorphism is in the range of 500 to 600 million years. And closely tied to that is the Vijayan complex, what is mostly meta-igneous, and again with corresponding metamorphic ages. And it's the boundary between these two that really intrigues us, because that's where the serpentinites are concentrated in the lime green. So thinking back to that model of double subduction, here's what we envision. In the early to mid Neoproterozoic, we think of a branch of the Mozambique Ocean closing with a double-sided subduction. So the Vijayan complex is to the east, the Vanni complex to the west, approaching each other. We don't yet have the highland complex forming, but there's lots of accretionary wedges in between that then usually become the highland complex, as you see in this figure B, and that completed by, say, about the Cambrian. And subsequently, outlined in the black circle, that's the real treasure here, where there's been post-collisional ultramafic intrusions, which drove all of the serpentinization that we see here. Now, secondarily, there are remnants of cratered morb more to the western suture between the Vanni and the highlands, and those could be areas of additional exploration as well. And as the question marks you can see in the dashed line on the map of the island indicate, that boundary is not well understood at this point. So there could be definitely additional discoveries to be found unexpectedly as eponymous with the name of this island, serendipity, if you will. So another schematic we can consider for this, at an intermediate stage, it would have resembled this. The highland complex forming and mostly driven by the accretionary wedges, and there would be basaltic underplating in the Vijayan complex, along with diuretic intruding bodies that formed in these mountainous regimes. And the residual thermal energy from those is what we think is driving many of the hot springs you see as red disks in this geographic map of the island. So I said we'll conclude with the fun stuff, looking at some of the field examples. I'm going to take us on a north to south traverse, essentially. It's not suggesting by any means that we walked directly along the geologic contact. We did not. Some of these areas are a bit inaccessible just due to heavy topographic variations. If you look at the contours here of elevation, they go above 2.5 kilometers towards the middle of the island. But even where you have the boundary, you can get pretty rapid change in elevation from essentially sea level at 50 tens of meters to hundreds, then going into closing in on 1,000 meters. So it's mostly the flat terrain that's accessible, but in especially thinking towards 2022, we're hoping to sample more extensively rather than the full sites where there's been past research done. So starting with the north again, the place called Yutagan Nabe, the field example is shown here in the middle. This is relatively typical of what the landscape looks like. So there isn't an accessibility issue per se. And then here are a few examples to the right. The undergraduate student from LSU, Alison Barbero, who was helping lead much of the sample coordination and analysis, her hand is there for scale. Some of these rocks are weathered, but if you split the rock, usually you find pristine, relatively unweathered material towards the core. And here to the lower right hand, there's another example from the field. Now this one's even more exciting. This is the place called Ginigal Palasa, which literally means firestone. Just due to the colorations of some of the rocks locals have noted here. And on the left, we get an example of what the field looks like. It's a little bit rougher terrain with more vegetation and brush. But most of the trees are stunted in growth, so accessibility is not all that bad here. It's the figures on the right that particularly engaged us. We have this darker matrix of denser material, superficially resembling iron-rich material, from which we have weathering out of these pebbles that are quite well-rounded. That could be like chert, possibly. And certainly with the Serpentinites in that 2016 work I noted, there is a suggestion of a ferruginous chert band that had been produced through the serpentinization. So it would be, if once we clarify the pathways of how it was produced, we would have a point of reference in thinking about Mars and what we might find in geologic context at serpentinization sites on Mars. So that's a definite plus. And the denser material we think is likely iron-rich, so it could be that ferruginous chert, and maybe the ferruginous component could be dominated by magnetite. Well, it's actually pretty sure not magnetite, but iron-bearing compounds. And then not concluding yet, going to Ginigal Palace next, that is more to the south of the island. On the left, we've got an example of what the field generally looks like, and on the right, an example of outcrops. At this site, we have more contiguous outcrops rather than float rocks that are more common in the prior two field sites. And now this site is essentially what I have in my virtual background. It's right along the coastline there. It's a pretty rough coastline, as you can see from, again, my virtual background. We were able to take this particular mosaic only because we had a drone fly over the sea and image looking backwards on the mainland. It's not quite accessible on foot. And then on the right, we have an example of one of the float to possibly outcrops that we saw. This variable degrees of weathering, and it is very close to the coastline. So particularly at this end of the Serpentine zone, we can also get a reference of what may have conceivably happened if you are willing to go out on a limb and consider, say, Martian, brine-rich, oceanic scale waters in places like Isidis interacting with Serpentinites. And that's another theme that we would try to explore. And now this one here, switching back to Yudagana, which is more to the north, highlights the potential for serendipitous findings. The park ranger who kept us safe in this protected forest area took us out here because the locals are well aware of these springs, where this, at the point of emanation of the spring from the serpentinite outcrop bearing units, but before it becomes more like a regular water setting, there's the microbial communities that are precipitating out essentially what look like Fe3 plus compounds. And we think this could be an example of microbes using the serpentinization zone on the island to sustain respiratory pathways, possibly in dissimilatory reactions. Shortly after that, when the water is clear, we do find regular fauna, like at microscopic scale, like fish, not quite at the stream head. And but these fish seem somewhat endemic to these particular areas. So there could be some unique aspects of adaptation, both across the macroscopic and microscopic scales of these ecosystems, that could broadly speak to habitability questions when it comes to Mars. Now, otherwise, this is just another iron-rich cold spring. And even in the worst case of, like, not necessarily worst case, but if you think of the null hypothesis, we might end up validating that the microbial communities here are pretty similar to those found elsewhere in iron-rich units and associated cold springs. So to leave you with a few retrospective points, I called it an epilogue, again, because of the exploratory nature of this work, rather than the explanatory side of things. I'm leaving you with these 4 points that I would like us to explore going towards 2022. And hopefully there'll be some interest among this group as well in thinking about them at greater length, particularly the first point on this metasomatic aspects, and the second one in terms of using these soil zones, variable pedogenesis particularly, to see what kind of effects, interplay, if you will, that may arise between perchlorates and other reactive halogen compounds in Martian soils and likely serpentine soils that may be co-present. And the porosity permeability limited nature is another aspect that is perhaps worth considering for what type of hydrology may have been associated with the Martian serpentinites. And the last point, the fourth one, can be a bonus if we manage to especially make comparisons between the hot water springs in the microbial communities and the cold water iron precipitating springs. And especially thanking the team who made all of this possible, as well as the funding agencies. I would also highlight our NSF Geo Allies collaboration, which we are hoping would have us take undergraduates of underserved heritage out to the site on the island to give them an experience in this Earth-Mars analog settings. And that's it. So yielding back to James and Francis. Thank you for listening.